little bit about me. I grew up on Buckeye Lake, so the canals have always been a part of my life. I don't ever remember a time when we didn't talk about canals. Now, being a retreaded history teacher, I should warn you, I'm used to 50-minute sections with a quiz at the end. So, be ready. I want to talk tonight about the Miami and Erie Canal. When Ohio became a state in 1803, there had been motivation to build canals in Ohio way before that. People had talked about we need to get around someplace. First settlers were, I don't know, you can't call them farmers yet, they were gardeners. But as time went on, that land became more productive and they had extra crops. Now, what do you do with your extra crops? You have to get them to market. And the problem was, when Ohio became a state in 1803, you couldn't get stuff to market. You traveled by, little wagon roads. Transportation was quite a challenge. So right away we started talking about how do we move the goods? How do we get stuff from the farms at home to a market? In 1803, when Ohio was a state, 1803, there weren't any good markets. Now, Thomas Jefferson, Washington, and Adams, and all those guys were aware of the canal systems in Europe. So they envisioned in America, if you look at the map, you can see the lines, in America crisscrossed by canals. They figured this was the way to move bulk stuff. Right after the Revolution, they started talking about canals. Canals on the East Coast, canals in the West. And what happened in Ohio, they've been talking about canals for a while. And then in 1817, when New York built the Erie Canal, we figured out the Erie Canal went from Buffalo, New York to New York City. And all of a sudden, people in Ohio figured out, you know what? If we can get to Lake Erie by water, we can get to New York City. And that was important because a farmer living in some place like Piqua, Ohio, if he sold a barrel of wheat locally, he might get $1. Now, the problem with that was, usually he had $1.50 in producing that barrel of wheat. Now, unless you're the United States government, that doesn't work. But if you could get to New York City, then you could get $8 to $10 for that same barrel of wheat. So the Erie Canal was the impetus in Ohio to actually finally start building canals. July 14, 1825, just outside of Newark, Ohio, were the first spades full of dirt for the canal system. 3 weeks late, on the 21st of July, down in Middletown, the whole bunch of people that had been in Newark came back over to Middletown, Ohio, and did a groundbreaking over here. The governor, all the people that were important. DeWitt Clinton from New York was here. And of course, now Clinton was here for a little personal reason. He wanted to run for president, and he wanted to see what kind of response he'd get out here in the countryside. So the canal system began on July 1825, and the governor, Ethan Brown, was bitten by the canal bug. He wanted to build canals. So Ohio undertook this canal building business, and Alfred Kelly was the engineer that was responsible for the canals. No, nobody in Ohio, civil engineering didn't exist in Ohio yet in 1825. If you like engineers, it's his fault that they're here in Ohio. They created a canal commission of 7 people, and one of the original canal commissioners was a fellow from Piqua, Ohio, named Johnston. So there was a local push to get this canal built. And it's interesting, when Ohio started building canals, people in Ohio at that time didn't say, oh my, can we do this? Or what's the cost going to be, and all that sort of thing. People in Ohio ask a very simple question: how fast can you get it done? How fast can you get it done? They knew that Ohio's economic survival depended on these canals. Now, it's amazing, there's a picture of Johnston house. The canal went right past his back door. Can you imagine that? Now, actually, in his defense, when they first laid out the Miami and Erie Canal, they were going to go up the Mad River Valley, but it didn't have enough water. So they moved over to the Miami Valley, and Johnston's house just happened to be on the Miami River. Originally, the first plan was to take a canal from Cincinnati, down there in the corner, kind of a crisscross across Ohio to Cleveland, almost where I-71 is today. But what they found out as they were starting to lay this out was, you see that empty spot in there because there weren't good supplies of water at that point. What our legislature finally arrived at, if you can imagine that, was a political compromise. They decided, okay, we'll build one canal that starts in Portsmouth, runs in a funny zigzag across to Cleveland, and we'll call that the Ohio and Erie Canal. And people over here on our side of the state said, well, gee, that's really nice, but that doesn't do squat for us. So they said, all right, we'll build another one. We'll start in Cincinnati. And eventually they said, well, in good time, we'll get this built all the way to Toledo. As I said, down here you see Middletown. That's where ground was broken. And the canal first went from Cincinnati to Dayton, and it stopped. And people to the north were not real happy with that, because Dayton was making money hand over fist, and all of a sudden, nothing up north. So the canal was continued north, and we got some help too, because Indiana was starting to build a canal that followed the Wabash River and was going to go out in Toledo, because Indiana has no access to Lake Erie. So they struck a deal with the state of Ohio to allow them to follow the Maumee River Valley and then come out in Toledo. So that kind of spurred Ohio on to finish the canal system. The Ohio and Erie Canal is about 308 miles long. Our canal's roughly 266 miles long. And when it was finished in 1845, it was called the Miami and Erie Canal. Now, real quick, a lot of times you'll read, they'll talk about the canals connecting the Ohio River and Lake Erie. Physically, yes, it did. Economically, it didn't. Economically, it allowed the interior of the state to get out to the edges with raw materials and then finished products to come in. It wasn't necessarily built to go from Cincinnati to Toledo. Here's the Miami and Erie Canal. Started in Middletown, Cincinnati to Dayton, stopped for a while, then began to go north. By 1837, it got to Piqua, and it stopped for a couple of years because, if you remember, I know you all remember your American history, there was an economic panic in 1837. So the money dried up for a while. It took a couple of years, and then it pushed the rest of the way north, and at the same time, Indiana was coming out into Ohio, and it met up there close to Defiance. There's a little town up there called Junction. Ever wonder why they called it Junction? And so you can see all the towns that this canal touched. And in the process too, you had to supply water. Canal was in Cincinnati, got to Toledo. Now, real quick about Toledo, if you look up there, you follow, you can see the river coming in, you see another little body of water coming. That was the canal. The canal was off to the right a little bit, to the west of the river, and it didn't come into the river at the lake. It came in, that's called Swan Creek. But it came in there, and then the goods would come down to the lake port and then go from there and could head east to the Erie Canal and get to East Coast markets. When we knew that this canal was coming out, have you ever heard of the Toledo War? When the borders of Ohio were laid out, the original line in the Northwest Territory was supposed to be a parallel line for the southern tip of Lake Michigan to the northern cape of Maumee Bay. If you look at that line, Toledo is above it. And it should have been in that territory to our north. Now, nobody cared about that until the canal came out. And people realized there's going to be a lot of trade there. We almost went to war over Toledo. We had armed troops on the border. There was one skirmish called the Battle of Phillips Corner, and there was one casualty. A mule was shot. But in the process, we got Toledo because Andrew Jackson, who was president at that time, looks at things, he says, now wait a minute, Ohio is a state. They have electoral votes. That place up north is just a territory. They're not going to help me. So Ohio got what they wanted. We won and we got Toledo. Like I said, I was just there 2 weeks ago. Michigan got the Upper Peninsula. And they thought they got a box of rocks until they realized the mineral wealth up in the UP. Now, the canal was built just like we do things today. We issued bonds. We sold bonds to build the canals. And so you had bond salesmen going all over Ohio, all over the East Coast. They even sent bond salesmen to Europe because Ohio goods were going to be going that far. And Ohio actually paid off all of their bonds. Ohio paid those off. Indiana almost went broke building the canal because they got into it a little bit later and they didn't make it. The canals were built by the lowest bidder. They bid them out in sections. Usually, if they were just digging canal ditch, it was a mile or 2 mile section of ditch that was bid out. If they were building a structure like a lock or an aqueduct or culvert, they bid that way. So think about all these contractors bidding on this, and it actually did all fit together. And so it was bid out that way. A lot of the workers that built the canals in Ohio were Irish and German immigrants who had built the canal in New York. The Erie Canal was finished. People came west because there were jobs. And they were indeed a skilled workforce because they knew how to do this. And you can see, a work crew there. Labor was in demand. You had the Irish and German. Also, locals in between farming seasons would come to work for the canal because you were paid in hard money. You got cash. And that was something that was tough to come by at that point in time. And you can see over time what happened to the prices. 1830, if you were a general labor, you got 50 cents a day. When I used to talk with school kids, I'd say 50 cents a day. They said, there's that much change in Dad's chair at night. But you can see over time, the wages went up and other states were building canals, so there was a bidding war for these workers. So you can see what people were making as the canal went along. And they say that the canals in Ohio, by the time we built all the canals, we built the two main trunks, canals coming in, lateral canals coming in from the side. Over 20 years, we built about 1,000 miles of canals in Ohio. The old saying goes that for every mile of canal that was built, one Irishman lost his life. And figures show somewhere around 3,000 Irish or immigrants were employed building the canal. So 1 in 3 didn't make it. It was a very unhealthy job. You think about they're digging through marshy land. They're using black powder to blast with. Dysentery, cholera, all that sort of stuff ran rampant. So it was not the healthiest job in the world to have, but it was necessary. And everything was done, picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows. Imagine digging a ditch 40 feet wide, 4 feet deep, 1,000 miles long, with a pick and a shovel and a wheelbarrow. And again, people in Ohio didn't say, oh gosh, can we do this? How quick can you get it done, guys? The stones, most of the stone work was done by Irish and German stonemasons. And on our canal, a lot of the limestone came from, guess where? Dayton, yeah. It came from Dayton, and then a little bit from Piqua. And then as you go north, it got harder and harder to get the stone. And then you start to see, and I've got some pictures of it, you start to see structures being built from wood rather than stone. And when we rebuilt one of our locks in Lockington, we were trying to find stone. And none of the Dayton quarries exist. They're parking lots now. So we had a tough time finding one stone. Picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows. You can see a section of canal that's being built through Cincinnati there. Think about this. The ditch was 40 feet wide at the top, 26 feet wide at the bottom, and 4 feet deep. Those were minimum dimensions. As our canal went north, it became a little bit wider. By the time it got to Toledo, it was between 50 and 60 feet wide. Now, why they did that, I don't know. But it got wider. But you think about, and 4 feet was all the water you needed to float a boat. Because the boats were very flat bottom, so they didn't have a lot of draft. One of the challenges faced just north of Piqua, there's a little town called Lockington. And it's at the summit level. It's the high point of canal. If you think about Ohio as a roof of your house, the continental divide in Ohio runs east and west. And Lockington sits on top of that. If you go to Lockington, that's the high point of the canal. That's called the Loramie Summit. And you're 512 feet above Cincinnati. So if you're traveling I-75 out here, depending on which way you're going, you're always going uphill or you're always going downhill. And then just north of Lockington, to a little town called New Bremen, is the other end of the summit, and you started the descent to Toledo of almost 400 feet. If you ever travel 75 up by Botkins, you'll see Lake Erie watershed sign. Maybe you've seen them. You've just started downhill. To deal with that, because obviously you can't just have one ditch. It's not going to work. You have to, from the top of Ohio, you have to start to build a series of lift locks. At Lockington, if you see there, in the first about quarter mile, there are 6 locks. The 6th lock is across Loramie Creek in the woods. There's almost 100 feet of the 512 feet at Lockington. So each one of those locks were built by hand. Interesting story there. If you look down here in the corner, see this house isn't square? The corner of that house sat on the towpath. Guy that lived there got tired of the animals rubbing against his house, so he cut the corner of his house off. By lock 2, there's a little brick building. It's a little red brick building. There's several canal era structures up there at Lockington, but that red brick building was called the Red Garter. I heard you. Canal boat captains' wives knew their husbands, if they went through Lockington, could get more than lunch at the Red Garter. And then this is Lock 1 north in New Bremen. They're numbered from the summit out. So the first lock at Lockington is Lock 1 south. This is Lock 1 north. Now, on the Ohio Erie Canal, where I grew up, we had 2 summit levels. You think that doesn't get confusing. Is this south-south or is it north-south? Took 105 of these locks to get up and over the hump of Ohio. Now, each one of these locks were built by hand. And most of them were built out of big blocks of limestone. Each block of limestone weighed about 500 pounds each. And the lock chambers were 90 feet long, 15 feet wide, and on average, they would raise or lower a boat 6 to 8 feet. So it took 105 of those to navigate the change in elevation in Ohio. Now, they're sort of like a water elevator. There's wicket gates. Each end of the lock had a big set of wooden gates on it. You had 2 different levels of water, so you had to equalize the water level to get the boats through. Okay, there you see a boat coming in at the upstream level, comes into the lock, shut the gates behind it. Then they drain the lock from the downstream side, and they're just using the physics of water always finding its own level. There's no pumps, there's no nothing, it's just what water naturally does. They would drain the lock until it would get down to equal that downstream level. Then they could open the gates and the boat could go on. Because once you got into the lock, you had no place to go. And the boats were about 70 feet long, 14 feet wide, so they barely fit inside the locks. John Quincy Adams, when he was president, made a trip down to Cincinnati to the observatory down there, and when they dedicated that observatory, he went by canal boat. And John Quincy didn't see the humor at all of bouncing through all the locks in Ohio. He didn't like that a little bit. But then once they opened the bottom gates, off you could go. And then to bring a boat upstream, you did just the opposite. You take the boat in on the downstream level, close the gate, fill it from the upstream level, and off you go. Now, they did as much as they could. It took, in our side of the state, it took 3 lakes to fill the canal. Mercer County Reservoir, that's Grand Lake St. Mary's today, was built for the canal. The Lewistown Reservoir is Indian Lake today. That was built to put water into the canal. And then Loramie fed the summit level. So you think about building 3 big man-made lakes, and those 3 were completed. That was the world's largest reservoir system. There wasn't anything bigger than Grand Lake until Hoover Dam was built. If you ever get up to Grand Lake, that lake is big enough that it actually kind of has its own weather because of just the size of the body of water. And they were very careful to save as much water as they could when the boat went through, because every time you drained a lock, you took 100,000 gallons of water down the canal with you. So you never got that water back. So you think about how much of a demand there's going to be for water. Many of the locks were built from stone, but as I said, as you got further north from Lockington, stone was harder to get. So what you started to see were locks built from wood. And this is Lock 1 in New Bremen. Trouble with that, it was more economical, but 8 to 10 years you were rebuilding the lock. So there was a lot of maintenance. You think about the canal system. You've got moving water, you've got dirt, you've got rocks, you've got wood. You're going to have maintenance. And they were really, you had Junction. They're really smart with the way they named towns. You had Junction, where 2 canals came together. This town was called Lock 2. It's a neat little town. It's still there. And then this is up in St. Mary's. This was Lock 13. And you can see the wood construction on that lock. Toward the turn of the century, Ohio did some funny things. Ohio built the canals and operated the canals until about the time of the Civil War. And then Ohio had the bright idea they were going to give this to lease this out to a local consortium, and they would pay the state to operate the canal system. Sort of like, remember a few years ago when our legislature had that bright idea with the turnpike? Remember that? Some of us reminded them it didn't work then, and it's probably not going to work this time. Because what happened was when they took the canal back, then they had a lot of repair work to do. And the wood locks, many of the wood locks then were capped in concrete, because the wood had deteriorated to the point that they weren't functional anymore. So you started to see concrete used. And the other thing that happened, as you're going north, up here just south of Spencerville, if you ever go up Route 66, up towards Spencerville, there was a big glacial moraine where the glacier had left stuff. And they were faced with, when they got there, they were faced with a challenge. Okay, do we try to tunnel through it? And it's over 1 mile long. That's a long tunnel. Do we build a series of locks to get up and over it? That's a lot of locks. Do we go around it? That's a lot of work. So they decided to dig a ditch to go through it. They called it deep cut. And you can still see deep cut today. And the story goes that On the north end, they had Catholic canal workers. On the southern end, they had Protestant canal workers. They got done in the middle, they had a riot. Some things don't change. There you can see deep cut. Imagine digging that. Some of it's 50 feet deep, some of it's 5 feet deep to get down into the ditch. And there was a little town on the south end of deep cut called Salem, and it's no longer there. There's also a lot of ghost towns around the canal. If you can look, you still see where some of these towns were. There's another look. There's the towpath. There's the canal. And that's what they dug through. Now, you've got locks, you've got a ditch, you've got lakes. Every time the canal came to a river or stream, they had to cross those. So they built aqueducts or wooden water bridges. This is an aqueduct that was at Lockington. I tell people, and sometimes they believe me, I say, if you look at that, that's Teddy Roosevelt and his wife. Kind of looks like him. But you think about, okay, a wooden bridge full of water. You know, isn't that a recipe for a problem? You can see him building the aqueduct. That was the Lockington Aqueduct. Now you tell me there's not going to be a problem with that over time. It's built on 3 stone pillars. You can still see where the pillars are in Lorimy Creek. They're still there. That kind of gives you a schematic of what some of the aqueducts look like. Up in St. Mary's, they built one. They replaced a wooden aqueduct with one out of iron. They figured maybe this will work better. Then also up north, and I apologize, most of my pictures are from up north because we got so much structure up there that it's easy to use as examples of what we have. This was what they called 6 Mile Aqueduct because guess what the name of the creek was it crossed? 6 Mile Creek. This one was unique though because it also relieved extra water out of the canal. Because that's the canal up there on top and you can see the water coming out. So that was one way to kind of balance the water to keep it from flooding as the canal travels through an area. Because a lot of this land is through farmland, and the last thing that farmers want is for the canal to flood their land. Then there's also a lot of culverts. Instead of building an aqueduct, this creek would come through, and they'd build a little culvert to carry through, just like we build culverts today. This culvert is just north on 25A of the Miami Valley Hospital in between Piqua and Troy. Thankfully, our county engineer at that time knew what he had, and they did a great job of preserving this piece of canal history. This looks almost exactly like what the pictures of the Twin Arch Culvert looked like when it was built. This one's further north, but look at the size of that. And then there's an even bigger one. You had the canal cross at Turtle Creek, and it was a big double-barrel culvert. And look up there, you can see the boats up there. So obviously they're doing some repair work to the culvert at some point in time. Now, when the canals went out of operation, they blasted holes in the bottom of those so the water all drained out. And Turtle Creek Culvert no longer exists. So you've got water in the canal, you've got 105 locks, you've got 3 big lakes, you've got innumerable culverts. Now you've got travel on the boats, travel. Now, this was I-75. Now, I came down the freeway tonight, and you see all those signs that remind you not to go faster than a certain speed, right? The signs that nobody pays any attention to. There was a speed limit on the canal. Speed limit on the canal was 4 miles an hour. Now you tell that to a kid and they say, I can feel my hair grow at 4 miles an hour. But if you remind them, a canal boat empty weighed about 16 tons. And a freight boat could haul about 80 tons of cargo. So you get almost 100 tons going down the canal. If you get it going much more than 4 miles an hour, the waves from the back of that boat become very erosive and it can wash the banks away. And there's a lot of places where the canal, we think about the canal as being a ditch, but there's many places where the canal is built up above ground or it's beside a river. And if that bank springs a leak, unlike the freeway, there aren't any detours. That section of canal goes out. So 4 miles an hour was an acceptable speed. And that was easy. The traffic cops in those days didn't have radar guns, but they did have a visual. They could see somebody coming toward their lock, the lock tenders could, and they could see if that waves coming off the back of that boat are higher than they should be, or if the mule driver is chugging along more than just a walking pace, that guy's speeding. And once they got it, remember the picture of the lock? Once the gates close, where do you go? You don't go anyplace until you pay your fine. And time was money. You didn't want to waste too much time. Now, the first boats were built just to haul freight. If you could load it on a boat, it would ship. And this boat on the left is what they call a 3-cabin boat. Got a back cabin, which would have been for the captain. Middle cabin would have been a stable for extra animals. Front cabin would have been for the crew. And then the middle sections, you can see on the next picture how they'd load those with freight. You think about that, 80 tons of cargo being hauled by 2 or 3 mules. That's really a pretty efficient way to move stuff. Because a semi today hauls about 50 tons. So the canal boats were hauling more than we have on the freeway today. Not quite as fast, but. And for a while, these boats became family businesses. Dad was the captain, mom might be the cook, kids might be the crew, oldest boy might be the mule driver. And that was home. So wherever the canal boat was, they were home. Now up north of St. Mary's is this big wide water, because when they built the canal, they rerouted the St. Mary's River. And they created this big wide water, strange enough, called 40-acre pond. It's just far enough north of St. Mary's that if the locks in St. Mary's were busy, a boat could sit and wait. It was sort of a holding area. And it was a great fishing hole too, and swimming hole and all that other fun stuff. What they used to do as a boat came up to 40-acre pond, they'd send the youngest guy running down the towpath to St. Mary's to find out what's going on in the locks. Can we go on or do we wait? Because there's no cell phones yet. This is the dark ages, remember? Up there also, there's a place called Bloody Bridge. Now, we talk about the canals and all sounds all romantic and all that sort of stuff, right? Well, not so much this time, because 2 guys, Bill Jones and Jack Billings, they were in love with Minnie Warren. And they both wanted Minnie. Well, Minnie, she chose Jack. Bill wasn't happy. He caught him one night on this bridge. He had an axe in his hand. Lopped off Jack's head. And Minnie was so distraught, she fell into the canal and drowned. So it's not quite as romantic as it always sounded. A few years later, there was a skeleton found in a well, and they always wondered, golly, was that Bill? Did he have remorse? Also, the canals were Main Street. This was where the action was. This is in St. Mary's. The canal went right past the businesses. And the boats could pull up right along the side. Then they could unload all the goods out of the boats right into the stores. So that's where the action was. That's down at Fort Loramie. And the same thing would have been true no matter where the canal went. You had what we would call Main Street today, but the real action was on the canal side. because that's where stuff was moving back and forth. And again, if you could load it, it shipped. There's probably barrels of wheat headed to New York. This is a picture of the water from Indian Lake came to Sydney and went through what they called the Sydney feeder, which was navigable. Because, okay, Sydney is the county seat of Shelby County, and if they connect Sydney to the canal, then Sydney becomes a trade center. So that's a boat loaded with stone coming out of a quarry. There's a boat loaded with firewood. Then eventually, canal boat captains figured something out after a while. They figured, you know what? I'll bet these people that live out here are not real smart. I'll bet people would pay to ride on a boat. So they started to charge people to ride on boats, and you started to get boats like this that hold cargo and passengers both. 10 or 12 passengers could ride on that, and then the 3-cabin boat changed. The back cabin became the captain and the crew. Middle cabin would have been for animals, because they many times carried a spare team of animals on the board with them. And think about that on a nice August afternoon when you trade animals out and they eat and drink and do what animals do after they eat and drink. Wouldn't that be nice? And then the front cabin would have been for the passengers. And on a boat like this, 10 or 12 passengers would share that space. And it wasn't very big. But you know, it's sort of first-class travel. We think about it back in 1845 or so. You know, you sit there, you can watch the world go by, you can talk to your fellow passengers about politics, and you can talk about President Polk and the Positive 4-Point Program. It was a great way to travel. In 4 places in Ohio, you can take that step back in time today because there are 4 canal boats that operate here in Ohio. So they're always a good trip. And you paid, depending on what you were shipping, you paid per hundredweight per mile. And different goods charged different prices. So, you know, that's the way the tolls were, that's how the canal was paid for, by the tolls that were paid. Various goods, various costs. And then eventually they decided, you know what? Why don't we just build boats to haul people? So they started to have passenger packets being built. And passenger travel was not the reason the canals were built. The canals were originally built so people could haul stuff to market. That was the reason for the canals. This sort of stuff happened later. This looks like it was probably a church group out on an outing. There was another kind of boat called a state boat. Remember that maintenance we were talking about? They had these boats that carried repair crews, tools, supplies, and when they came up to something that needed repair work, then you had these big white state boats sitting there. This one was a boat called the Homer Meacham. They were having the funeral for the captain. And if you look at this real close, you can see the chair in the middle of the deck. It's got a picture of the captain sitting there. And they had just come back from his funeral. But then if you look a little bit further to the left, you can see some of the crews down there in the water doing their laundry. So men, tools, and materials on the state boats. See why they needed to do repair work? Orange barrel season is not new in Ohio, folks. We've had orange barrels for years, although they were big white state boats at that point in time. Typically, 2 or 3 animals pulled the boats. And you know, they generally pulled in tandem because one of the questions we always get asked is, how did 2 boats cross? Or how did 2 boats pass? And the rule of the road was the upstream boat always had the right of way because the next lock was probably in the downstream level, so they could slide right into the lock. So what would happen if this boat were going upstream, if they met another boat, that boat would pull over to the far side of the canal, and then this boat could just pass over their tow rope. And that's why the mules usually walked in tandem. And usually the mule driver was the youngest guy in the crew. Did you know we had a U.S. president that was a mule driver? Garfield. And wouldn't that be a good training to work with Congress? Especially right now, maybe? Garfield didn't last very long, though, as a mule driver. He saw the light. The most seasoned guy on the crew was the helmsman, the guy that could steer the boat. And then you had 2 or 3 deckhands to get the boat through the lock, to get the ropes and things that needed to be done. So that was basically your crew. Ever seen that Seal of Ohio? It tells you how important the canals were to Ohio if they put the canal boat in the Seal of Ohio. Now, if you've ever been to Cincinnati and you look at Sugarloaf Mountain, the canal is not in front of Sugarloaf Mountain. This was an artist's idea. Tremendous amount of growth came to Ohio because of the canal. Ever been to Akron? Ever seen Market Street? 16 locks on Market Street. It's a stupid place to build a city. But a canal came in from Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania-Ohio Canal came in Akron. And Akron was the beginning of the breakfast foods industry in America. And it's also, remember we call that part of Ohio the Rust Belt? Iron ore coming out of the Great Lakes, coal coming out of Pennsylvania. They meet in that part of Ohio, steel mills. Chillicothe was on the canal. I'm going to Chillicothe in a couple weeks. A Hocking Canal went through the coal fields down in Hocking County, down southeast Ohio. The canal was built so the coal could come out of Ohio. And you know, the canal did not go through the state capitol. Now, can you think of anything worse than the state capitol not being on the canal? So they built a spur that went up to Columbus to get the capital on the canal. Warren County, Lebanon, they're just a few miles east of the canal. They said, wait a minute, what about us? So they decided to build their own canal. Didn't last too long. It wasn't profitable. It was only 20 miles long, and it wasn't used very much, so eventually it went out of business. You can see they thought it would cost $124,000. Missed a little bit, cost about twice that. And then they sold it for $40,000 in 1854. This was when Cleveland became a big city because of the canals. We already talked about Toledo. This is over the Rhine in Cincinnati. Cities were brought together. This was the way news traveled from place to place by canal. And you had lots of industry. Here's a boat being loaded with coal. And you can see they're loading the coal down, and they got a little raft on the other side catching the extra coal so it didn't go into the canal. Mills. Think about what you had with every lock. You have moving water. Wouldn't they be a great place for a factory? Because you could start to build mills that use that water power. That was the other way the state made money, was they leased the water power out. And imagine this time of year how busy they'd be at harvest when they're getting ready to ship stuff. Down in Franklin, there's a flour mill. Livery stables along the canal, another great industry. You got to have animals, you need farriers, you need harness makers, you need all that sort of stuff. And ice. Cutting ice in the wintertime was big business on the canal. You cut the ice, put it in an ice house for summer. Love this picture. Toward the end of the canal era, the canals began in 1825. The death knell of the canals was really the flood in 1913. But if you look at this picture, you see the canal boat. The animals are walking on a railroad track. There's power poles. And look at the factory, automobile stuff. And, you know, the 1913 flood, we all know what happened in the 1913 flood. This is after the flood. This is in Cincinnati. They started hauling boats out of the canal down to the river. This is, if you look at a map of Cincinnati, this is 4th Street and Plum. Those are now parking lots on both sides of that intersection, by the way. And it really, truly was the ditch that brought the world to the wilderness. You could live in a place like Dayton. You could buy things from all over the world. And you could afford it because people have more money in their pocket and stuff came in cheaper. So it did connect us with the world. And you can see there what the canal was, the first big growth spurt. Every town that the canal touched blossomed. We all remember when they were building the freeways, right? Every town wanted the freeway because that was going to be economic growth. Well, that was the same thing there. It brought all this stuff, and retail changed because now this was the first specialty stores. Stores that just sold hardware, just sold clothing. So the canals changed the face of Ohio tremendously. And that's the end of our journey. Well, anybody got any questions? If I don't know the answer, I'll just make it up.
I'll get one. What about the railroad? Didn't the railroad help bring about?
The railroads did too. And one of the ironies is there's pictures of the canal carrying railroad building material and the railroads bringing canal building materials. And so by 1850, the railroads were carrying the same amount of freight as the canals. By 1860, they had surpassed the canals, but the canal still was a great way to haul bulk stuff. So yes.
I'll go in Miamisburg and West Carrollton.
Pretty much right through town. You think about Patterson Boulevard here in Dayton. That was the canal. Patterson Boulevard was, yeah, and then yeah, and then you get on down further south, and it kind of pretty much went through the towns.
Are there any displays at Carillon Park?
Yes, and Carillon Park is because they moved a lock to Carillon Park, but that lock is not where it belongs. That was moved. So yeah, there are displays there. Yes, sir.
It must have been a terrific problem to get water from the Hite winds. When has the Hite wind done this, and where did the water come?
Okay, the water. Some of the water came from Grand Lake or the Mercer County Reservoir, and that water all was connected by a feeder that went into the canal, and all that water went north to Cincinnati. Yeah, north to Toledo. All the water from Indian Lake followed the Great Miami River down to a little town called Port Jefferson. If you've ever been to Port Jefferson, it was moved out of the river into a canal that went then on down through Sydney and into Lockington, and that carried all of Indian Lake's water south. What's interesting, I'm sorry, but if you look at a map, Mercer County Reservoir and Lewistown Reservoir are almost on the same latitude, but that continental divide splits it, and all of the water from Indian Lake goes south. And then Loramie was in the middle, and it fed the summit level. You could see where the water from Loramie went into the canal. You could watch it go both directions. So they built three big reservoirs to do that as well. Yeah, tremendous amount of water. Yes, sir?
Did they run 24 hours a day?
Some of them did. Some of the boats did. They were called express packets. And that's if you go someplace, you see a lot of the boats are painted very bright colors. And the reason that was, a couple reasons. One, if it was a boat line, then that identified, just like a trucking company, trucks are all painted the same color. That tells you this boat line kept their schedule, this boat line's got a good cook on board, yada, yada, yada. Also, if you're traveling at night, if you hang lanterns from a brightly colored boat, you can see it. Because when I was at the Johnston farm, our section of canal, about 8 o'clock at night gets really dark. So yes, some of them did travel 24 hours a day. That's why you had extra team of mules on board the boat with you.
What was the general season for them to go down the river?
The canal boat, that was one of the problems with Ohio. It kind of goes back to the railroad. Railroads were 12 months out of the year. In Ohio, the boating season, 8-9 months, because Ohio's just big enough north to south that the canal may be open in Cincinnati. It may be open from Dayton to Cincinnati, but closed from here north because of winter. So the canals were not a year-round, were not a year-round proposition.
You said that there are still some portions of the canal that have boats or that you could.
Yes.
Would you tell where those?
Sure. One's in Piqua at the Johnston farm. On the Miami area, then you got up in Toledo, in the Toledo Metro Parks, at Ludwig Mill. There's a boat there, and that's a great ride because that actually goes, they've actually got a working lock. You can lock through there. Another boat on the Ohioan area canals in Roscoe Village, Coshocton at Roscoe Village, and then the fourth one is at Canal Fulton. So we have 4 in Ohio.